Good morning and welcome to National Flood Insurance Program for Real Estate Professionals, brought to you by Louisiana REALTORS in conjunction with Fema. Joining us today are Gil Garant, Regional Flood Insurance Liaison for Fema Region 6, and Rebecca Dake, Training and Outreach Specialist for Fema Region 6. As a reminder, it is important to be on camera for the duration of this course in order to receive the 2 hours of CE credit for real estate licensees that has been approved by LREC. Please be courteous and mindful of other participants in this course by remaining in an engaged stationary position while in session. Questions can be posted in the chat box. At this time, all participants will be muted to ensure the quality of the presentation. Also, as a reminder, Louisiana REALTORS has a disaster resources page on our website under the REALTORS tab. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Angela. Hi, my name is Rebecca Dake. Just a quick overview of what you're going to be seeing today. We're going to cover tons of information, so I'm going to get started here. Again, Rebecca Dake here. I started with FEMA probably about 3 weeks before Hurricane Harvey hit. And then as a FEMA employee, I was deployed to that Texas disaster, and I was able to hear from survivors, and that really fuels my passion for the type of education and information that you'll get today. I heard so many things from survivors, things like, I didn't know I was at risk. I didn't know I needed flood insurance. I didn't know my homeowners wouldn't cover this type of damage. Maybe they even said that somebody told them at one time they didn't need flood insurance or couldn't get it based on maybe what zone they were in. So a lot of that fuels my passion for trying to clear up some of that misinformation. And then also our team has obviously worked on Louisiana disasters recently as well. So same type of fueling the passion for getting the information out there. And you guys as real estate professionals are so important in trying to communicate some of that flood risk information and flood insurance information. Gilbert Giron and Teresa Schaubecker, they will be answering Q&A and helping in the chat. So definitely type your questions and comments in there. And there are a few QR codes today, and that's that little scan looking icon you see in the top right. You can just hold your camera up and it'll open up a website. But a PDF of this presentation is also in the chat for you to download. So thanks, Angela, for putting that there. And I just wanted to share my appreciation to Louisiana REALTORS for bringing this class to you. We love this partnership to be able to get you guys some credit, but also getting the information out there. We also have a state partner. We're going to talk about them a little bit later. Our state partner is the State Nfip Coordination Office, and they're with Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. So first, we're going to start off with an overview of some flood insurance facts and talking about a little bit about Louisiana. So Louisiana has tons of areas of flooding, tons of different types of areas of flooding. When we think about urban areas, we can think about runoff. So we have a lot of paved surfaces. Maybe in urban areas, the drainage was designed a long time ago. So is drainage keeping up with the pace of new development? But when we have paved surfaces, we have a lot of runoff that can cause a lot of flooding. We also in Louisiana have tons of riverine and bayou areas. So these obviously can overflow, they can back up. And then Louisiana, we have a lot of flood control systems. So a flood control system is awesome. It can reduce your risk, but it never eliminates risk. And levee and flood control systems can and do fail. And then we also have our coastal areas. So we have risks that come with wind and water and wave action. So lots of areas of flooding in Louisiana. Lots of reasons for residents and your clients to be thinking about their flood risk and the need for flood insurance and other types of insurance. Teresa pulled this information here, just a quick reminder that rainfall and changing weather patterns, climate change, the intensity and the duration and how often events are happening, where we're getting tons of rain in just a short amount of time, this can cause huge problems. And can our drainage systems keep up with this? Can local drainage systems keep up with this? So just kind of a little shocking reminder there from the Lake Charles area, but we see this in other areas as well. Just a little bit of information on flood insurance policies in Louisiana. So if you're looking at this chart, just for how the columns are going up and down, we can see that over time, Nfip flood insurance policies were kind of declining, on a decline if you're kind of looking towards the middle of the chart there. And then after the 2016 flooding, you can see there was definitely a jump in Nfip policies. And so kind of a step back up towards more people being covered. And we do see this in other states and other areas. After there's a disaster, you will see that bump or that increase in coverage because people understand, oh, maybe I haven't been impacted in a while, but now either I didn't have coverage and I know I need it for the future, or I did have coverage and, oh man, I've got to keep this. As of right now, we have about 490,000 policies in Louisiana. However, when you look at, census data and how many households there are, it's about less than 3 in 10 households are covered by Nfip flood insurance. And, not even all of those policies necessarily are for residential type of structures or for renters. So we encourage flood insurance, but this also shows that flood insurance gap. What does this mean for recovery if we have 7 out of 10 households who aren't covered by this flood insurance and being able to make a faster recovery after an event. And then for Nfip claims in Louisiana, unfortunately, Louisiana holds the #1 spot for Nfip claims across the country. So, and Louisiana also has 2 of the top 5 costliest Nfip disasters. So that would be Hurricane Katrina in 2005, over $16 billion in payments, Nfip payments, and then the 2016 flooding with about 2.5 billion in Nfip payments. So what is the National Flood Insurance Program? This is something we really like to educate people on, and what we'll be talking about in this presentation. We're not just going to be talking about flood insurance, because the Nfip is more than just a flood insurance policy. So we kind of think, we try to describe the Nfip as a 3-legged stool. If you have one of the legs that's not equal with the others, it could be unstable. So we want all of these legs to be working together to provide a steady and stable national flood insurance program. So what are those parts of the stool? We have hazard identification. You'll see that leg on the left. So what is this? This is what you'd think about if you're thinking about the flood maps and the flood insurance studies. And there's also other flood risk products as well. So developers can use these. Homeowners can use these. Our floodplain management professionals and the local communities use these. And then when we think about mitigation as being a second leg of the stool, well, what does that include? So from our perspective, that includes floodplain management working in communities. And that's a really important part to understand. These are locally adopted floodplain management regulations. The local communities adopt and enforce those. And then also mitigation projects that help reduce risk would also be considered under this part of the Nfip. And then the part you're probably most familiar with, and that would be the flood insurance side. So Nfip flood insurance, I don't sell it. I'm not an insurance agent. You're not necessarily going to Fema to buy a flood insurance policy, but we work with write your own companies, and they are providing the insurance, which is federally backed. So now let's talk a little bit about the maps, the flood insurance rate maps. If there's one main takeaway that I'd like everybody to leave with, when you think about the flood maps, is that there are no risk zones on the flood insurance rate maps. And a lot of times as professionals, real estate professionals, insurance agents, we kind of misspeak. Even FEMA staff or floodplain managers will misspeak. We'll talk about you're in the risk area or you're outside the risk area. But we want to make sure everybody understands there are no risk zones on the maps. And actually all areas would be considered a floodplain. So it's kind of just a matter of higher risk floodplain area, maybe a moderate to lower risk floodplain area, but all areas can and do flood. So those higher risk areas, of course, they're kind of the areas where we have mandatory purchase, floodplain management regulations, but everybody lives in an area with some amount of risk. And that's really important as professionals that we're communicating that to our clients. So some of the terminology that you might hear today, or you'll hear in relation to the NFIP would be special flood hazard areas, the acronym SFHA. So what are these? This is the area that would be inundated when we have a base flood event. That's a 1% annual chance flood event. Some people just refer to this as the floodplain, but really it kind of may designate a regulatory floodplain or that mandatory purchase area, but even areas outside of the special flood hazard area are also floodplains. Just they may have a different level of risk or different hazards in those areas. A base flood elevation is probably something you're familiar with. So this is the estimated level of flood water that we would anticipate water will rise to or go above for that base flood event, for the 1% annual chance event. So some people mistakenly think, oh, well, the base flood elevation is the highest the water is ever going to rise. And really that's completely incorrect. It's where we anticipate it will rise at least to for this size event for the base flood. But if we have an event that's bigger than the base flood, the water level will probably exceed the base flood elevation. Flood insurance rate maps. Again, these are maps that now with the changes for risk rating 2.0, kind of some of the main purposes would be designating those mandatory purchase areas, and then also delineating, and that's delineating the special flood hazard areas, and that will also mean floodplain management regulations in those areas. Floodways, we have a picture of that coming up, but floodways are the area where either you're going to see water, or sometimes in a floodway, you may not even see water right now, but it's that area that has to be kept. So when there is a base flood, the water will be able to flow and discharge without flooding additional areas. So in floodways, special regulations do apply. We'll talk about that a little bit more coming up here. So what is the base flood? It's really important to understand this. Sometimes people get frustrated when they think about the flood insurance rate maps and they say, well, I can see this darkened area, that's the special flood hazard area. Well, why did it flood over here? Why did it flood outside that area? So one thing you do need to understand about the maps is the maps are based on the base flood. So it's designating areas that are going to be inundated for a 1% annual chance event. And that's that some people used to call this the 100-year flood. We still have a lot of people that talk in those terms, the 100-year flood, the 500-year flood, the 1,000-year flood. We definitely don't like talking about that because from a consumer level, it gets people thinking, oh, this isn't going to happen again if it's happened recently. However, events can and do happen that are greater than the base flood. So that's a really important connection that you need to make when you're thinking about the flood insurance rate maps. They're showing us a specific risk event, that 1% annual chance flood event. But events can and do happen that are bigger than that. So you can expect flooding to happen outside of those special flood hazard areas or deeper within that special flood hazard area if we have an event that is larger than the base flood. So just a quick overview of the zones. So those special flood hazard areas, and again, this is where mandatory purchase is going to apply. So If you have a federally backed loan or mortgage, you're going to be required by your lender to get flood insurance. And typically these are going to be our zones A and B. So you can see those listed here. The A zones kind of denote more of a riverine flooding area, and the B zones denote more of a coastal flooding area. So this is where mandatory purchase applies, those A and B zones, where minimum floodplain management regulations apply, and then kind of a next level of flood risk or flood areas, we have moderate flood risk zones. So these would be your zones B or your shaded zone X areas. And this would be the area where people are talking about, oh, this is denoting the 500-year flood event. But again, we don't like to talk that way. This area has a 0.2% annual chance of flooding. And what that means is, you could have two 500-year events that happen in the same year. You could have two of these events that happen back to back year after year. So it's important to understand that flood insurance is not required here. It's not a mandatory purchase area. We have a lot of communities that do not have floodplain management regulations in these areas, though some do, but it's highly, highly recommended that flood insurance is bought and kept in these areas. So those moderate flood hazard areas are often right next to your highest risk flood area, right? So if an event happens that's bigger than my base flood, this is probably going to be the first area to flood because it's just adjoining it. And then we have minimal flood risk areas. And no, I'm not saying no risk flood areas, minimal flood risk areas. And these will be your zone C or X. On the newer maps, they're going to look like X unshaded areas. And again, we really recommend flood insurance is also kept here. Another thing to know about our flood insurance rate maps is local drainage is not necessarily depicted on the flood insurance rate maps. So let's say in a zone X area, if there's some local drainage problems, that's not necessarily going to be captured on the flood insurance rate maps. You could have a lot of flooding in that area. Flood insurance isn't required, but really it's still recommended. It could still flood there. Zone Ds are another type of flood area, and these are areas that we say have an undetermined flood risk. Often these are very rural areas. Takes a lot of money to do map updates and studies. And that's why everybody doesn't just get a new map every year. It would take a lot of money to do this, right? And a lot of resources to do this. So these zone Ds, a lot of times they're pretty rural areas that money is not necessarily being spent to study that area because a lot of times studies are going to be focused in more areas, in areas that are more populated or have more development. And then going back to that question, why does flooding happen outside of high risk areas? There really are multiple reasons. So a really big one would be maybe some changes in land use. And this is not necessarily, a FEMA issue. This is going to be a local issue. At the local level, the local community has land use authority. So they're determining, hey, what type of development are we going to put here? What are we going to allow here? Is it going to be commercial, residential? What are we going to do in this area? So you could have changes in land use that affect flooding in that area. And of course, development happening can affect flooding in all different flood zones, not just your SFHA or your highest risk flood areas. And again, the more development we're bringing in, usually that comes with more paved surfaces, all of that runoff and that stormwater drainage, that's going to affect flood zones adjacent. It can affect people up and downstream. So really, we encourage what we would call whole community floodplain management, looking at how do we manage floodplains and also stormwater drainage, especially across all of your flood zones, would be really important. Another reason would be changes in weather patterns and terrain. FEMA is really dedicated to trying to talk about climate change and also produce flood risk products that are going to account for climate change and future conditions. So we're not necessarily there yet with our flood risk products, but that's something that we are really working on, and these will be future products that we are putting out. So the flood insurance rate maps right now are kind of a snapshot in time, and a lot of times it's looking back using, for example, historical rainfall data, but in the future, we may have flood risk products that are taking into account future conditions. So that can be a really good thing. Another reason, of course, is flood risk changes over time. So the flood insurance rate maps, you really shouldn't think about it as a static thing. If your community has development, your flood risk is going to be changing within that community. Maybe if you don't have a lot of development, your maps probably could stay pretty accurate, but as long as there's development, that risk is changing, and that's affecting both your special flood hazard area and even outside of it. So one way FEMA allows for these changes for development to be captured in the maps is actually through the letter of map change process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but this is a really important way for communities to keep their flood maps up to date. So what's happening now is going to affect flood risk in your community, and that data should be going into your flood maps to help keep them up to date. So quick overview again of some of those zones that we had talked about before. So now let's think about the A zones. So on the left here, you can see a map, and it looks like we're having more development. We have some of those shaded areas over to the left, and there's actually some detailed information on the map. We call these zones AE. So it's an A zone that has elevations or denoted base flood elevations. And usually these are going to be in more populated areas. And then over to the right, you'll see a zone A. So there are not base flood elevations shown here. And you can see over to the right, it looks like, maybe this is a more rural area. It could be developed in the future. It could be being developed right now. But currently, we don't have detailed information, things like the base flood elevation. Both of these A zones, this is something that you can tell your clients. Both of these are areas where you'll have, for that base flood event, you have a 26% chance of flooding over the life of your 30-year mortgage. So both of these are high-risk flood areas. Flooding can and does happen in these areas. For those areas over on the right, those zone A areas, FEMA is working really hard, and with our state partners and other partners, to get estimated base flood elevations. And we do have a resource on that in our resource section. There may be estimated base flood elevations available in your area. And this is something developers can use. And you can also get a base flood elevation from your local floodplain administrator. We're going to talk about floodplain administrators a little bit later. But both A zones, again, mandatory purchase of flood insurance is going to apply here if you have a federally backed loan or mortgage. It's a high risk area of flooding. We have some other A zones and some levee or flood control related zones. So a zone AR, this is where we had a levee, or we have a levee, but hey, it's not providing the level of flood protection that it should. Maybe it's not accredited anymore, but it's in the process of being restored. So mandatory purchase is going to apply here. It has a special designation, a zone AR. Zone A99, this is also an area where mandatory purchase of flood insurance applies, and this is where a federal levee is being constructed, and it's making progress towards completion. And then we have another type of levee or flood control area, and this is actually a zone X with reduced risk due to levee. And it's really important to know about these areas as mandatory purchase does not apply here. So you have a flood control system that is able to be shown that yes, the flood risk is reduced. It's able to be changed to a zone X. It will look like this. That image to the right, kind of shaded, and it will denote that it's protected by levee. So really important to know. It's awesome. It's amazing that the risk is reduced here, but the risk is never eliminated. So flooding can and does happen in these areas. And without mandatory purchase, unfortunately, some people do not proceed to purchase flood insurance. And if a catastrophic event would happen, if we have a levee overtopping or failure, unfortunately, some people would be left without coverage, and possibly because it's not mandatory. So just a quick look at the zone B.
Move on.
Yep.
I'm sorry. We had a couple questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to.
Sure.
I wasn't able to get in. But we have a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind clarifying from the chat. We have been asked if you can please go over the special flood hazard area one more time.
Excellent, sure. So on the maps, this is going to look like a shaded area, and it's going to be any of those zones will start with an A letter or a V letter. So it's going to be a shaded area. It's going to be all of your A zones, all of your V zones. And what does special flood hazard area mean? It does not mean this is the only place flooding can happen. It just means that based on an analysis of the base flood, or that 1% annual chance event, this is where we anticipate that the water will spread to, and maybe how deep we would anticipate that water would rise to. So that's kind of on the technical side. And then for flood insurance, the special flood hazard area will denote where does mandatory purchase apply if you have that federally backed loan or mortgage. And then on the floodplain management side, FEMA minimum federal standards require that all of our communities that participate have locally adopted floodplain management regulations in those special flood hazard areas. So as a real estate professional, if you're selling a structure that's in a zone A or B, there's going to be permitting ramifications to that. There's going to be development and even improvement ramifications to what people can do in those areas and how they can do it. And that's based on local ordinance.
Great. So we have another question. Is grandfathering over now? Would you like me to take this one?
We are going to get to risk rating 2.0 and the flood insurance later. So can we hold that question, Gilbert?
That's great. Outstanding.
Awesome.
Okay, so we got a few more. How often does FEMA change the base flood?
Good question. And I like that it says, how often does FEMA change the base flood? So that's an important thing to note. We're going to talk a little bit more about map changes coming up, but actually the community should be submitting data to FEMA that can change the base flood elevations on the maps. So again, development happens within a community. So me at the federal level, my other federal partners, we don't even necessarily know all the development that's happening in a specific community, right? But the community does, and the community participates in the program. And part of their agreement for participating in the National Flood Insurance Program is when there are changes to their development, they should be requiring sometimes studies, hydraulic and hydrologic studies for the development that is happening. So that information can be fed, that can be sent back to FEMA, and then the maps can be kept up to date. So part of that will depend on how much development's happening in your area, what requirements your community has for what requirements they're putting on developers, or for example, maybe the community is doing their own drainage study and they're doing their own development. They should be submitting that information to FEMA. So part of it depends on development and how quickly that information is getting back to FEMA to help keep the maps up to date.
Okay, another question is, what's X 500 code mean? I believe they're referring to the 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2%. If you can elaborate on that one a little bit more, please.
I'm sorry, I think I unmuted someone else instead of myself. We're actually going to cover those X zones coming up right after we cover coastal zones here. So I'll hold that question, Gilbert.
Okay, so there's a good question here. What is if the property is half in the AE and half in the X zone?
Excellent, great question. So you could have a property, let's say you don't even have any type of structures. That property could be, could have multiple zones within your property. You could be, let's say you may have an A zone for part of your property, and you could have a zone X for part of your property. So a higher risk and then a moderate to low risk flood area right on that same property. What we need to know as real estate professionals, if someone's thinking about developing that land in the future, that's something to consider, because if you can try to be doing more of that development in the zone X, you're probably going to have, you won't be potentially subject to floodplain management regulations, would have mandatory purchase in that zone X portion of the parcel. Still good to mitigate and get flood insurance. So thinking about the property itself, the land, but then if you do have a structure, if any part of that structure is touching a high risk area, so one of those zones A or B, even a little corner of the building, that structure is considered in the special flood hazard area, in the high risk area. So things like mandatory purchase of flood insurance could apply, floodplain management regulations for improving that structure or developing that structure further. So really good information to know, hey, what does this property, the land itself and the structure itself, what does this mean for future development, for what I can do with this property right now? And one more thing to note there is, the flood zone also and the flood risk could change in that area based on, again, things like climate change, other development in the area. So just because you have a property that's zone X right now, it doesn't mean in the future, based on that unique flood risk of that community, that it wouldn't be remapped and considered high risk area in the future.
All right, thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Gilbert. All right, so our coastal areas here, we see our zones V and VE. So over to the left, it's kind of showing us an example of a structure that's right along the coast. So our zones VE area, this is where Fema or our partners have done detailed studies. And so we have those base flood elevations for our coastal high risk areas. And zones zone V, just like when we were talking about zone A, this is probably going to be a less developed area. We don't have the detailed information to say, hey, this is the base flood elevation in this area. But for both of these V zones, there's some really important things to know. So in our coastal high risk areas, there's actually special floodplain management regulations, because not only do we have a risk of flooding, but along the coast, we have things like wave action. So we don't just have the typical pressures of flood water kind of moving slowly or pushing into a structure or rising around a structure. We have waves that can really move hard and fast and rise high, providing a lot of pressure against the structure. So any development in these V areas are going to have special floodplain management regulations. And we also recommend as a higher standard that communities think about some of these coastal design regulations, actually adopting those a little bit inland, what we would call our coastal A zone flood areas as well. So our V zones, again, this is where mandatory purchase would apply. Just like with our A zones, if you're in one of these areas, you have about a 26% chance of flooding over the life of a 30-year mortgage. So these are special flood hazard areas, high risk flood areas. Even if you aren't subject to mandatory purchase, we recommend flood insurance in these areas. All right, so moving on to our moderate to low risk flood areas, we're going to talk about these zone X and shaded zone X. So both of these X areas, no matter which one you're talking about, it's mandatory purchase does not apply here. It does not mean that flooding cannot happen in these areas. In fact, if you look at Nfip data, flood insurance claims, we have about 40% of our claims come from these moderate to low risk flood areas. So this is something you can pass along to your clients. Hey, a lot of claims happen here. Flooding still happens here, even though flood insurance may not be mandatory. It really, really is recommended. So let's talk about what are the shaded zone X areas. And these are actually the areas that you can see in this, the parts that are circled yellow. The map that's on the top is the same as the map that's on the bottom. It's just kind of a different view. There's a little bit more detailed information in the map that you see at the bottom. And we'll go over where to find these maps coming up here in a moment. But the shaded zone X areas on the top map It has kind of little dots. It's a little bit hard to see to the top left or that bottom right. And on the bottom map where you have a little bit more detailed information, it looks like that tan or that brown area. So a lot of times these shaded zone X areas, they edge right up to a high risk flood area or the special flood hazard area. So a lot of times you'll see these adjacent to the highest risk flood area. So again, if an event happens that's bigger than our base flood event, you can really expect flooding to happen in these shaded zone X areas. Some people call these the 500-year floodplain. Again, we try not to say that to clients because it gets people confused. But the shaded zone X area, again, we really recommend flood insurance coverage here. And then zone X, this would just be all the other area that you're seeing on both of these maps. And this also kind of can be confusing for people because they get on maybe through your Louisiana Realtors or looking at the FEMA Map Service Center and you're saying, all right, what zone is this structure in? And you see, okay, great, it's in this zone X. Maybe it's in the middle of one of these maps here. There's no shading. There must be no flood risk here. And really, we don't want people thinking that way. Yes, maybe you're in this zone X area, but it can and still does flood in these areas. And then floodways, we said we'd talk about this a little bit, but both of these maps, the floodway is kind of the long curvy part that you're seeing in the top right map. It has kind of an aqua outline with the diagonal lines, and on the bottom in the bigger map, it's shown as kind of the red hashed area with the diagonal stripes. So again, when you're looking at a floodway or you come across a property, if you have a buyer or seller that's thinking about a property with a floodway, this is going to be a really restrictive area of development, something that is going to need permits through the local community, potentially even a costly engineering analysis to do development in this area. And again, you may see water here, but you may not see water here. If it hasn't been raining, if water isn't discharged, you may see a floodway and actually looks dry on someone's property. But this is where we need to be able to allow the water to go to carry the base flood. And that's actually, moving through different people's properties, through different watersheds and probably out to the Gulf of Mexico eventually. So good to know special regulations apply if you have a property that has a floodway on it. And then another note again, just because a property doesn't have a floodway designated right now, if you see maybe a small waterway on a property, it potentially could be studied and designated as a floodway in the future. So where do we find maps? For FEMA, our go-to place where we're keeping all of the maps and also the map products is called the FEMA Map Service Center. You just type in a location and you should be able to pull up a map and you can print off a little area showing where that location is and the different flood zone that it's in and the flood zone surrounding it. You can also view all the products that have to do with this area. And if there's detailed information in the area, your community would have a flood insurance study. So this is, it'll look like a PDF booklet. Sometimes it's many hundreds of pages long, but if you have time and you're ever interested in learning a little bit more about the flood risk and the flood studies that have happened in your area, you could open it. You could search up your parish or your community, look at the flood insurance study, and it will give some history and background of flooding and flood studies that have happened in that area. This is an additional way to view the maps. This is called the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. I love using this. The only limitation is if you're in an area that has older paper maps and they haven't been turned into digital maps yet, you will not be able to see that area shown on the National Flood Hazard Layer. But as long as your community has digital maps, this is, I think, kind of a better visual way to view the maps. I like using this one. Unless your area has older paper maps, you're going to have to look through the FEMA Map Service Center. So we had talked about this a little bit before, letters of map change. So there's there's a few different things that can actually change a flood zone designation, maybe for a property, or if a lot of development's happening and it's changing the way the water is moving on a property or those base flood elevations, a letter of map change needs to be submitted to FEMA. And so just a few of those different ones, a letter of map amendment, that's the first one listed here. We call it a LOMA. This is what you could kind of expect for maybe an individual structure. Let's say you have a structure that it's in the high risk flood area, so it's in a zone A or zone B, but maybe based on its natural grade, maybe it's kind of up on a hill. You think it actually may be higher than the base flood elevation. So you could, that property owner could submit a letter of map amendment. And if the elevation certificate, the information's matching, that structure could actually be removed from the high risk flood area. Mandatory purchase would not apply on that property. Although we still recommend that people get flood insurance on that property. And in the past, this is kind of a new way of thinking because with flood insurance rating changes, in the past, people used to think, well, I'll proceed with this letter of map amendment process, even though I'm in this A or B zone area. If the letter of map change can say, yes, hey, I'm high enough, I can be shown as zone X, and they would automatically think, all right, I'm going to get that discount. Maybe I'll be able to get a preferred risk flood insurance policy through the Nfip. So these map changes are not going to have a direct effect on flood insurance anymore. So that's kind of a break in thinking, what we kind of used to think about this. So why would somebody still want to proceed with this? Of course, it could still remove mandatory purchase. That person may not be subject to the local floodplain management regulations for that community. However, we cannot stress enough, we recommend that flood insurance are still carried on those properties. Letter of map revision and letters of map revision based on fill. If fill is being brought in and elevating a structure, these are things that developer, that structure owner will need to make sure that they submit. And potentially, again, that could change flood zone designation. It could remove mandatory purchase, but it will not have a direct effect on your flood insurance rating. Physical map revision. This is more when we think about, hey, in my area or in my parish or in my community or watershed, they're doing a big map change process with new preliminary maps put out and effective maps that need to be adopted. This is what we call a physical map revision. So this doesn't happen as often, and that process actually does take many, many years for those to move forward. I did see a question coming in there about where can you find the flood insurance study information, and if Gilbert or Teresa, you can put the FEMA Map Service Center and the View More Products portion. That's where you'd be able to find the flood insurance study. Another great resource, you can always call your floodplain administrator. This is a local official, and they can help you locate that type of information as well. We'll talk about floodplain administrators more coming up here. This is actually a way that you as a real estate professional can see, are there letters of map change in this area? Because again, if that buyer or seller is looking at a property, maybe it just appears like this is in the high risk flood area, but you can actually view letters of map change on the National Flood Hazard Layer, and maybe that would actually show that that structure has been removed from the high risk flood area. So you can go to the viewer. Some people feel comfortable using this map interface, some do not, but the most important thing to know is you would type in an address or a community. There's layers over to the top right. So you'll click on those layers and you'll want to make sure that you enable the check the boxes for letters of map revision, letters of map amendment, and then little purple circles will show up. And you can click on that, and there's an example of that in the top left image here, and it will actually say, hey, for this structure address, here is the letter of map amendments. You can actually view these online. So this is definitely something good to know. If a seller already has this, This is information that they should be disclosing to a potential buyer. Somebody would want to know, has there been a map change on this structure? So some people ask, can a structure be removed from the special flood hazard area? Here's an example of when that may be able to happen. So we have a structure over here to the right, and we're assuming that this structure is in one of those A zones, maybe an A or AE, and it has natural grade underneath. That means that fill hasn't been brought in for this structure. So we're going to have two things to see if this structure can be removed from the high risk flood area. So one of those would be that the lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation, and the base flood elevation in this image is shown as the red dotted line. So if we're assuming that where the light gray is meeting the dark gray, so it looks like our lowest floor is above the base flood elevation. Great, that would be one requirement. And then two, we need to make sure that the lowest adjacent grade is also above the base flood elevation. So what is the lowest adjacent grade? If you walk around a structure, the lowest adjacent grade is where the lowest part of the foundation of that structure meets the outside ground or grade. So the lowest adjacent grade on this image is over to the right. It's kind of has that little circle and it says lag. So now we have this property is meeting these two requirements. Its lowest floor and its lowest adjacent grade are higher. They're at or above the base flood elevation. This person could submit a letter of map amendment, and this structure could be technically removed from the high risk flood area. Mandatory purchase wouldn't apply, although we still recommend flood insurance. Now, if we look at that same type of question or situation in a coastal area, you may think, well, this structure is elevated, so maybe it's above the base flood elevation. Well, hopefully the lowest floor will be above the base flood elevation. So you can see that on both pictures. Looks like the lowest floor is at or above that red dashed line. However, if we're thinking about lowest adjacent grade, if we take a walk around all of these structures, the lowest part where the lowest part of the foundation is meeting the grade is almost always going to be below the base flood elevation in a coastal area. So in a coastal area, you're probably not going to have many structures being removed from the special flood hazard area or removed from the mandatory purchase requirement. So this is a really, really good number for you guys to know for anybody. This is a number you can give to your clients, general public. This is a number you can call as an insurance professional or a real estate professional. Our floodplain administrators can use this number. What is it? It is our FEMA mapping and insurance exchange. So what type of information could a caller get from the line here, which is 877 FEMA map or 877-336-2627. You can ask general flood insurance questions and they'll be able to give you an answer on that. Maybe you have a question about the maps in your area and you don't really understand, or you're saying, hey, I'm on the FEMA Map Service Center, but I'm not sure where to look for that flood insurance study. They can help you with that. Maybe you have a structure owner that wants to know more about a letter of map change or a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision with that fill. They can call the FEMA Mapping and Insurance Exchange and get information and other resources for what steps they would need to take next. This is also a number that somebody could call. Let's say maybe you have a flooding event, but you can't remember, hey, who is my Nfip policy with? I know I have a policy. I can't remember my agent or my company. I could call this number and they'll be able to tell you, hey, yep, you're with them. You know, you can be able to contact your agent or your company. So really good information, number to save in your phone and to be able to give out as well. A really, really other good resource, and a lot of times real estate professionals don't know about this, is the local floodplain administrator. So your selling zones and high risk flood areas, those zones A and B, that person is going to be thinking about, hey, what are the requirements for these areas? The local floodplain administrator We'll be able to give mapping type of information, zone type of information, and floodplain management regulations for those type of structures. And our state partner, Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, they do have a lookup where you can see who the floodplain administrator is for your community. You guys as real estate professionals probably sell across parish lines. You sell within multiple communities. There is a different floodplain administrator for every community. Occasionally we do have a floodplain administrators who will represent multiple communities or maybe a whole parish, but if you're looking at a specific property, you're going to want to know, is this in the parish? Is this in the city? Is it in a town or village? And you'll want to look up that floodplain administrators. They're an excellent resource. And then there are also other flood risk products out there. And we really recommend that you as real estate professionals and your clients be looking at all the flood risk data that's out there. Don't rely just on the flood insurance rate maps, because if there's other information out there, such as you're looking on flood factor and you see this area is showing as a higher risk on flood factor than maybe it shows on the FEMA or the flood insurance rate maps, that's really good information that your client can use, that you can use that risk information. Okay, it looks like maybe there is more risk that we should be taking into account here. Is this the property that I want? Do I need flood insurance on this property? And then also we had talked about there may be areas where you can get an estimated base flood elevation. So if this information is available in your area, and this would be kind of if you have a lot of those zone A areas where the base flood elevation is not shown, you can use this site and look it up, and it will, if that data is available in your area, you can even get a flood risk report. That's the image on the bottom right. And it will kind of give the client or give you a visual. All right, for the 1% annual chance event or that base flood, hey, it's saying that water would rise about 1.3 feet, or for that 0.2% annual chance event, water would rise about 1.5 feet. Wow, I want to be covered for these types of flooding events. And then also the information in the estimated BFE viewer, it's information that developers can download and use to be thinking about higher standards developing in those areas. So they could be using those base flood elevations and meeting or exceeding those as well. But again, those regulations will also be based on that local floodplain management ordinance. So we have a quick quiz here. You can type your answer in the chat. So we're asking about how many of these structures are outside of a flood zone. So go ahead and type in the chat. Looks like there's a lot of structures here. About how many structures are outside of a flood zone? So we've got a few answers coming in the chat. Many people are saying 0 or none. I don't see any numbers higher than that right now, and I love it. Thank you guys so much for paying attention there. So our blue or our aqua areas at the bottom, that was our special flood hazard area or our highest risk flood area. But even this zone X that's shown where all these structures are in either a zone X or shaded zone X, it's still a flood zone. There's still a risk of flooding here. So that's really important to know. All these structures are still in a floodplain. It may not be our highest risk floodplain, but it's a floodplain, it's a flood zone, and it can and does flood in these types of areas. So we're going to get into floodplain management a little bit here. And for the National Flood Insurance Program, there's actually responsibilities at different levels. At the local level, this would be your community. It's actually voluntary, whether they want to be in the National Flood Insurance Program or not. So if they want to be in, they have to adopt and enforce a floodplain management ordinance. We're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up here. But those land use regulations, all of that is with the local community. And we also have tribes that also participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. At the state level, I mentioned our state partner is the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. So they'll make sure that there's enabling legislation for these smaller communities or parishes, towns, and villages to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations, that land use authority. And they'll also provide guidance and assistance to the communities. So our state coordinator, Cindy O'Neill, and her team at the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, every day they're on the phone, they're emailing, they're visiting with Nfip participating communities to make sure they understand their responsibilities, how they're administering and enforcing their ordinance at the federal level. So we developed the minimum floodplain management standards. We actually, interestingly, just had an open public comment period that we tried to also promote to our stakeholders, and people could say, you know what, the FEMA minimum standards have been around since about 1976. They've gone through small changes, but not substantial changes. So FEMA is actually looking at, should those minimum federal standards for floodplain management at that local level, should they be raised? Should they be made a little bit more restrictive? And a lot of people did provide comments on those. But we developed minimum standards that the communities must adopt and enforce. We're of course providing that federally backed flood insurance. We are the basis for those flood studies and the flood risk products. We also give money to our states and cooperating technical partners to also be studying that flood risk and produce flood risk products as well. And just like at the state level, every day our team, Teresa Gilbert and I, our other floodplain management specialists, we're helping out our Nfip participating communities, providing guidance and assistance. So that local floodplain management program is really based on them adopting an ordinance. We say this is a quid pro quo program. You can't have this federally backed flood insurance in your community unless that community adopts and enforces a floodplain management regulations and ordinance. Some of our communities across Region 6 and across the country, they tie their building code standards and their floodplain management standards together. It's kind of all in one. And that'll kind of depend on the community, whether they do that or not. But from the floodplain management side, even if it's tied together with their building codes, they must at least meet those minimum federal standards for floodplain management regulation. And a tip for real estate professionals is these floodplain management regulations and ordinances, they vary in every single jurisdiction. You may have a town that has different standards than the parish. So you need to be, your clients need to be aware, where am I purchasing? What are the floodplain management regulations in those areas? Permitting is a big way that the local community makes sure that they're administering their ordinance. So it's really important to know all development in the high risk flood area. So all development in your zones A and your zones B, it needs a floodplain development permit. And this is something you don't get it from FEMA, you get it from your local community. And this is going to help the community make sure, hey, if you're grading, if you're mining, if you're building a new structure, if you're improving a structure, that it meets our floodplain management regulations. This is all to try to reduce flood risk in the community in those areas. Elevation certificates, this is kind of a big change as well for us as real estate professionals, for insurance agents as well. When we thought about the elevation certificate, we probably thought about it being tied to flood insurance and having an EC to be able to get a flood insurance quote and policy. Elevation certificates are actually used by our Nfip participating communities, by many of them, to make sure that this structure, this development, or these improvements meet our floodplain management standards. So it really is an administrative tool that many of our Nfip participating communities use. If your community happens to be in the community rating system, which is a higher standards floodplain management program, we're going to talk about that in a minute coming up here. If your community is in the CRS, they actually require that the elevation certificate is used for floodplain management. And then the elevation certificate, this is the new change with risk rating 2.0, is the EC, it's not mandatory to use it to get that quote or coverage, but you can provide it if it proves beneficial to the structure owner. So it's something we still recommend. If it's going to provide, if it's going to be beneficial to your premium, go ahead and provide it. We'll also talk more about the disclosure later and people being able to provide this if they have one. And then the elevation certificates also are kind of that background and information that can support a letter of map change, like those ones we talked about, the letter of map amendment. Can this structure be removed from the high-risk flood area? You're probably going to need an elevation certificate to support that letter of map change. There's a lot of information on the elevation certificate. We try to do education and outreach to our floodplain administrators and surveyors, and the floodplain administrators doing outreach to surveyors. But if there is detailed information in your area, so let's say you're a VE zone, you're an AE zone, a lot of times, sometimes those surveyors just look at the map and pull the base flood elevation off the map, but they actually should be going and getting that detailed information. The base flood elevation may be a little bit different. That's shown on the map is actually a rounded number. So that's an important thing for surveyors to know, floodplain administrators to know. We recommend that you're providing color photographs with the elevation certificate. It can help on the floodplain management side, that floodplain administrator know, is this in compliance, is it not? It could also help support some of that information that's used for risk rating 2.0, again, if it's proving beneficial to you. And we do recommend, hiring a licensed surveyor professional for elevation certificates. One more note I'll make on elevation certificates before we move on is that the elevation certificate and the floodproofing certificate, these are actually in an open public comment period right now. So what does that mean? They actually, they did drafts of the documents that have a few changes based on risk rating 2.0 and those new flood insurance rating changes. So it's something that you can actually view the draft elevation certificate for 2022 and the draft flood proofing form. You can take a look at those. You can make a public comment on regulations.gov. And Teresa, if you could put that in the chat here, if anyone is interested in looking at those drafts and providing comment, that comment period is open until May 9th, if you're interested. So as a real estate professional, insurance agent, you may have feedback that you'd like to put into how these forms looked and how you think that draft looks. Here we're showing you some elevated air conditioning units. So this is going to show us a few things here. So floodplain management regulations will actually, let that structure owner know how high they need to build their lowest floor to. They'll also let them know, what type of foundation they can use. And even things like machinery and equipment, those air conditioning units need to be elevated to at least the base flood elevation or higher. So you can see these air conditioning units, and it also looks like maybe that lowest floor, they're both elevated off the ground. That's a good thing. We recommend going over and above that base flood elevation, because again, we know events can and do happen that are greater than that base flood event. So the flood insurance Nfip policy ramifications of something like this could mean repetitive loss. So let's say we have these air conditioning units here and you have a flood, you're making a flood insurance claim because your air conditioning units were damaged. Even just 2 claims of $1,000 or more in any 10-year period on an Nfip policy can actually trigger that structure to be considered a repetitive loss structure. So it's important for real estate professionals to know, of course, insurance agents and others, property owners, Nfip claims stay with the structure. My claims don't move with me as a policyholder to my next address. They stay with that structure. So if I'm a structure owner, I make 2 claims, I sell my house, that new structure owner, they'll also have 2 claims on that structure as well. So there can be a surcharge, so an extra charge for repetitive loss properties. Essentially, it means that we know there's blend flooding here. There's potentially a higher flood risk, potentially a higher flood insurance premium. And then also on the floodplain management side, it's good to know about enclosures. So if we're thinking about any of our high-risk flood areas, again, our zones A and our zones V, we have to be thinking about, hey, what is below the base flood elevation on that structure? So let's say we have a crawl space underneath that structure and the crawl space is below base flood elevation, or maybe we have an elevated structure in a zone B. We need to make sure that lowest floor based on the floodplain management regulations is at or above the base flood elevation. But for everything underneath, it's really important to know for real estate professionals, the space below that lowest floor in these zones A and B, it can only be used for 3 very specific things, and that's parking, access, and storage. So this image you see in the top right here, this is a crawl space foundation. That space, of course, can only be used for access. It's going to need to have flood vents to allow that water to move in and out and not collapse that foundation, move that structure off its foundation. So enclosures, it's really important to know parking, access, and storage. If you're in a coastal high-risk area, you have an elevated structure, all that's below that lowest floor can only be used for parking, access, and storage. Sometimes people will maybe unknowingly go against the floodplain management regulations. Maybe they'll put a living quarters, maybe they'll add a small room, space for somebody to sleep down below that base flood elevation. It's really a huge liability. It's putting people's lives and their property at risk. So that's a big no-no based on the floodplain management regulations. This is just a quick example to show you. This is kind of, you're thinking about it being the same structure. The image on the left here, if this is a crawl space foundation, this is, let's say it's in one of our A zones. If this is a crawl space, but it doesn't have flood vents, actually the bottom of the top of that crawl space floor is going to be considered your lowest floor. And this structure might be out of compliance with floodplain management regulations. Out of compliance for a structure owner could mean fees and fines from the local community until that time you mitigate the structure, like you put flood vents into a structure. And then this structure over to the right, it shows proper flood venting. So this structure could be compliant with those floodplain management regulations. I see a question in here, Gilbert, about what about a bathroom? Bathrooms would not be allowed under those elevated structures. Parking, access, and storage would be those. And then base of an elevator. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Actually, we have quite a few questions, but there's been several comments. Wait to the end to address Q&A. So I've been capturing them, and when we get closer to the end, I will present all the questions for you to respond on.
Awesome, thank you. And there are regulations on elevators, but they potentially could be allowable. Do we have a technical bulletin on that actually that we could put in the chat as well? So thanks, Gilbert. We'll move on to some floodplain management regulations that it's good for real estate professionals, insurance agents, general public to know about after a disaster. So there could be really real ramifications of buying a structure or property in a high-risk flood area, so those zones A and V. When there's a disaster and when you're recovering, you may be subject to some very specific things. So we'll talk about those here. So when you're recovering from an event, everybody wants to put that money back into their structure. Okay, we need to repair it. People want to try to get back to normal as fast as they can. However, when we're thinking about those dollars going back into a structure, we know these are high-risk flood areas. So those dollars should be meeting floodplain management regulations potentially. So we know these structures, if they're in a high-risk flood area, they're going to need to get a permit to make repairs before they're repairing their structure. And this is from their local floodplain administrator, their permitting department, their building department, and the local community is going to tell that structure owner if there's any additional requirements that they need to meet in their recovery process. And there's actually something called substantially damaged structures. And this is something the floodplain administrator is going to be looking at. Let's take, for example, this structure in the top right. looks like we have an older, maybe a slab on grade structure. It looks, maybe there was a tornado or just a high wind event. It looks like a tree just demolished some of this structure. The floodplain administrator is going to have to do an inspection and assessment on the structure. And if the damages are 50% or more of the pre-market value of the structure itself, then this structure would be deemed substantially damaged by the community. And if this structure is below the base flood elevation, this structure may need to actually be, let's say, elevated rather than just making those drywall repairs, those other structural repairs, those roofing repairs. And then it's not just how much damage the structure has, it's also if I'm repairing my structure, but I'm also thinking about, you know, I'm putting these repair dollars into my structure anyway. If I have the means, maybe I want to update my kitchen while I'm in this repair process. Maybe I want to add on an extra room. This is something from the floodplain management side, they may consider substantial improvements. So that could, those improvement costs would actually be added to those damage costs. And so again, that could make a structure meet that 50% or more of pre-market or pre-improvement value. And we do have some guidance on this. There's a good Q&A book, but this is something big for real estate professionals to know about. If my home is substantially damaged and I'm selling my house, it's definitely something you would want to disclose to that potential buyer, because that buyer may be on the hook for mitigating that structure due to the local community's regulations. And elevations.
Rebecca, we're having a couple of requests for a small break. Can we break for 10 minutes?
No, I think we're gonna just keep going. Angela, I don't know if somebody can, hop up for a quick drink.
Hey, it's Angela with Louisiana REALTORS. This session is only 2 hours. We don't have a break for a 2-hour session. We have another session that starts after this one at 1 o'clock. So we need to stay on time. We don't take breaks for 2-hour sessions. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry about that, guys. Hope you have your drink here. So the elevation certificate, this is something that can help show, hey, is this structure in compliance? Does it, meet that current base flood elevation? This is something you'll talk to the local floodplain administrator about. And then it's also important to know if you have an Nfip policy and you do have damage from flood, you may be eligible for what we call increased cost of compliance, and that could be up to $30,000 to help mitigate your structure if your local community says you're substantially damaged or being substantially improved. And if Gil or Teresa, if you can put the increased cost of compliance link in the chat if people want more information. We do have a quick acronym for how you can remember what mitigation options you might have if you are one of these substantially damaged or substantially improved structures. The acronym we say is FRED. You may be able to flood proof, but that's only for non-residential structures, maybe commercial structures. You may have to think about relocating your structure outside of the high-risk flood area, of course, elevating, and then D for demolish. Sometimes it's actually more cost beneficial to demolish a structure if it has tons and tons of damages, and you could rebuild a more resilient structure rather than just trying to make repairs on that damaged structure. And the image here is just trying to give you a visual of a home to the left. This lowest floor looks like it's below that dashed line, the base flood elevation. And, that's okay. We have a lot of older structures that were built before the community's floodplain management regulations. That's okay. People aren't from the floodplain management side, there's not necessarily a ramification of that. But if, a lot of times these are older structures, if they're damaged or improved, when they are, you're going to need to, through the local community, get a permit and make sure that you are elevating that structure at least to or above the base flood elevation. And we really recommend going higher than the base flood elevation because we know it can and does flood higher than that level. We do have a few articles here. I'm sure you guys have seen articles like this. As a real estate professional, this could definitely be a hard property to sell. Homeowner says the home has flooded 9 times. this is out there. In Louisiana, we do have structures that have multiple losses. There's a few articles that that can show you, talk a little bit more about those repetitive flood losses in different communities. And then the two articles to the right on the bottom are also kind of getting at that connection between if local communities are not enforcing their floodplain management ordinances and they're not enforcing substantial damage and making people mitigate when they're reconstructing or rebuilding after an event, even though that's really hard and that can be an extra cost burden, it really does help break the cycle of repeat damage. And when you don't have good floodplain management and those post-disaster floodplain management duties that the community has, if they're not following those, where are we going to be for the next disaster? We're going to be right back in the same boat, same type of structures getting damaged next time. And that hurts property owners. It hurts the whole community. So we do recommend that communities adopt higher floodplain management standards. We do have many in Louisiana that adopt higher floodplain management standards. Why would a community want to adopt more than those minimum federal regulations? Maybe that community has a lot of population growth. They have a lot of development. So they're going to want to think about, hey, let's go over and above what FEMA requires. We need to do what's right for our community based on our development needs. Maybe a community doesn't have a lot of development, but they're adjacent to a community that has a lot of development. So we have to think about water moves through watersheds. It can move downstream. It can also back up upstream, right? So if you have a community next to you that has a lot of development or changes, you as a community that doesn't have that growth may still want to think about higher standards as well. And then with climate change, it's definitely good to be thinking about, hey, we know events are happening that are more intense, more frequent. Let's provide some extra level of protection for our community. So one example of a higher standard is something you're probably all familiar with, which is freeboard. And what is freeboard? It's just an extra level. Sometimes it's 18 inches, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet above base flood elevation. So it's just an extra height level of elevation protection above the base flood elevation. But there's lots of other really good higher standards as well. So the community rating system is actually a higher standards floodplain management program. Being in the NFIP itself, it's voluntary for communities. If you don't want to join, that's fine. You may have limited access to things like federal disaster assistance after a flood event in your high-risk flood areas or mitigation grants. So we do have a lot of communities that participate in the NFIP, though it's voluntary. And on top of that, the community rating system is also voluntary. So these are communities that they're like, you know what, we want to go above FEMA's minimum standards and we want to be rewarded for what we're doing to take those extra steps and provide some resilience for our community. So in Louisiana, we have about 318 NFIP participating communities. I think we have about 30 communities that don't participate in the NFIP, but the community rating system, this beneficial floodplain management, higher standards system, we only have about 41 community rating system participating communities. So we're working to try to get more communities in. I know our state partner is as well. But we do have a lot of our more populated communities are in the community rating system, and Gilbert and Teresa can put the link in the chat here. It's also in the PDF in the resources section. And you can look up, hey, is my community participating in the community rating system? What are some of the benefits of being in it? It's thinking about whole community floodplain management. It's thinking about things like where do we have open space? How are we helping mitigate repeatedly flooded structures? It's things like flood warning systems. So a community can get credit for all these activities that they're doing. And the really, really cool benefit, one reason we're really pushing the community rating system right now as well is community policyholders in that community will also get a flood insurance premium discount. And it begins with a 5% discount for class 9 communities. And that goes all the way up to a class 1 community. They can get a 45% discount for all policyholders in that community. And we just had the city of Tulsa in Oklahoma go to a class 1 community. So they're policyholders will be able to get a 45% discount on their policy. So in Louisiana, we want more people being able to get these bigger discounts. As a real estate professional, or maybe a an insurance agent, what could you do to help promote the community rating system in your community? Talk to your local officials about joining if they're not. Maybe you can have a community discussion on maybe how the private sector could help improve the community score. A lot of these communities have what they call a program for public information. It's a group of professionals in the community that meet on their community rating system and the activities that they're doing. And a lot of times they want to have real estate and insurance agent reps on those groups. So you may be able to volunteer for that. Let's say your community is not in the community rating system. Maybe the community is smaller. It doesn't have a lot of staff to be able to put budget towards somebody doing the administrative work of being in the CRS program. Just a suggestion, but maybe some different private sector partners could get together, and maybe you could help fund a position for somebody to be able to run the CRS program. So just a thought there. And now we'll move on to flood insurance. So just a few facts on it. First, it's important to start off with what is actually considered a flood under the National Flood Insurance Program. Kind of baseline, what do you need to know? It needs to be 2 or more acres or 2 or more properties. And one of those would have to be the Nfip policyholders property. So 2 or more acres, normally dry land, or 2 or more properties. And then a few more facts. Of course, flood insurance is only covering flood damage. So we just went over, hey, what is flood damage? And there are residential and non-residential policies, and those do have different coverage limits. For residential, structure coverage limit would be $250,000, $100,000 for contents. For non-residential, it's $500K for both structure and contents. And super, super important for you to know, I don't want anybody to be burned if they don't know this, that your structure coverage is not automatically tied with your contents coverage. So let's say you're required based on your federally backed mortgage or loan to get coverage. It's probably going to be covering the loan amount for your structure. So you want to make sure, talk to your insurance agent, make sure you have coverage for both your structure and your contents. After a disaster, it can be devastating for somebody to find out, I thought I had flood insurance, but come to find out it only covered their structure, not their contents. And what is your contents? If you think about turning your house over and shaking it, your contents would be the things that are falling out of your structure. There are some coverage limits on contents, which you can read more about in like the summary of coverage for the Nfip or the flood insurance manual. We also really want people to know that renters can get flood insurance for their contents. That's a really big one. Unfortunately, after a disaster, a lot of our applicants for FEMA disaster assistance are renters. A lot of them do not have that type of insurance. And we know that having that insurance, having flood insurance is really going to help you be able to recover more closely to where you were pre-disaster. Flood insurance is also available in any zone. And another good thing to know, especially, coming up on hurricane season, we've had a lot of hurricane or wind damaging events. Hurricane Laura, for example, in some areas we had more wind damage than flood damage. So under the Nfip, water damage that is kind of caused by actually, let's say it's coming in through the roof, a failure in your roof, or it's coming in through a failure in your windows, it's probably not going to be considered flood damage and covered under the Nfip. So wind-driven rain damage, not covered under the Nfip. You would probably be thinking about water coming from outside your structure and rising up. And sometimes if a person has both types of damage, they're going to have to file 2 different types of insurance claims, maybe homeowners, wind, and flood insurance. And adjusters may have to be sent out separately to determine, hey, what damage happened and what was the actual cause. Someone did ask about, hey, what if we have tons of structures that are worth more than 250,000. So you may be able to get private flood insurance to supplement on top of the NFIP insurance, but those are the coverage limits under the NFIP. In Louisiana, again, we said we have about 490,000 policies. A majority, 60% of those are actually in moderate to low risk flood zones, those B, C, and X zones. We have about 37% in all of those A zones. Maybe it's an AE, a zone A, 0.5% in our coastal areas, and about 2.5% in those unknown or D areas. Louisiana, over 20.7 billion in claims payments over the years. The average payment is about $55,000 per claim. So that's a huge, huge benefit for policyholders. This is the average NFIP claim. Some people ask, hey, can I get an average policy quote? And this used to be a little bit easier probably for real estate professionals, insurance agents. You used to think about, hey, well, what zone is this in? I know a preferred risk policy in a zone X costs about this much. We used to be able to give that type of information, but with Risk Rating 2.0, every structure is going to have a unique flood risk and a unique flood insurance premium. So we're not insurance professionals. You definitely need to contact insurance agents. And we recommend, hey, call a few different agents. They should be giving you the same quote, but maybe agents have different levels of comfort or education with the new system. So calling around to get a few quotes is definitely a good thing. And then also, again, just another reminder, we recommend, being able to provide the elevation certificate if it proves beneficial. We have a few slides on Risk Rating 2.0, and we also have a 2-hour CE class just on Risk Rating 2.0 and the rating changes. So I'm not going to go into depth a lot here. We actually are doing that class at 1 p.m. Today, but I do want you to know some basics, and I want you to know where to go to get some resources. So we do call this Risk Rating 2.0 Equity in Action. There are a few things about the system that's actually making the rates more fair. So we're taking into account things like replacement cost value. So smaller homes are no longer subsidizing larger, more expensive homes. They're not just paying the same type of premium anymore. We no longer will see a rate cliff. So this would be something like maybe you were selling a home in a neighborhood, and on one side of the street, you had a property that was zone AE, but right on the next side of the street or very close to that property, you have a structure in zone X. So you could have had very different rates pretty much just based on zone, but now the rating system will look at those two different structures and a lot of different attributes and say, you know what, if the structures are more similar, maybe they will have a more similar rate, or maybe these two structures have really different characteristics about those structures. So maybe the higher risk structure will pay a higher risk rate. For dates, starting in October, and you guys would have noticed this, if somebody's just coming in, buying a new policy as of October 2021, those new rates, new policies were being rated at their full risk rate. And then we're now in April of 2022. So now everybody who's renewing, when they come up for renewal, their policy will be subject to Risk Rating 2.0. So they should be able to see, hey, what is my full risk rate of my policy? And that doesn't necessarily mean that's what I'm going to pay this year, but it may be what my policy is going to go up to over time. Or maybe my policy is actually staying about the same, or maybe in some cases, my premium will be cheaper than it was before. So a few things about what is changing. I know right now we're hearing from a lot of insurance agents, they don't think it's as simple right now, but we really are aiming to make it a more simple quoting process. A lot of things in the system are based off, hey, what is your address? What's your geolocation? And just getting a few pieces of information from clients to be able to give them an accurate risk picture. Hey, this is what the insurance industry says is the risk associated with this property. getting rid of that requirement for the elevation certificate, which may have been prohibitive for some people. So that's an improvement. FEMA is also increasing mitigation credits for things like elevating your machinery and equipment and flood venting. And then the community rating system, we had talked about that before. In the past, those in the high-risk flood area would see a bigger discount than those outside of the high-risk flood area. And some of that was because in our Zone X, a lot of people had those preferred risk policies, but now a really cool thing is across the board, everybody, all those policyholders are going to be able to access that community rating system discount. So again, it could be anywhere from 5% to 45% if your community is participating. What else is changing? FEMA is looking at a lot more flood risk data to get an accurate picture of that risk. We will be looking at prior claims, although you're kind of getting a kind of a pass until you have your first claim. FEMA is not necessarily going to take those past claims into account. And then replacement cost value. This is something that is new to be able to calculate a premium. So a more expensive home with a higher replacement cost value, potentially will have a higher premium than a lower cost home with a lower replacement cost value. FEMA's getting rid of the preferred risk policy and grandfathering. So that was a question from before. So let's say with grandfathering, if you're continuing to renew your policy, it's not like I will lose all of my discount at my next renewal, but my policy will be kind of on a statutory capped increase per year up to that full risk rate. We're also getting rid of the mortgage portfolio protection program and submit for rates. And then here's an example. Over to the right, you can see there's a few things laid out about this policy, but the two arrows are pointing to some things that we want to point out. So the full risk premium should be shown. So this policy is looking like it's about $1,200. This person is getting a $300 discount for their community being in the CRS program. They're getting a mitigation discount of $100. And then if we go down below, we can look, hey, what is their total annual premium? It's actually lower than their full risk premium. So why might that be? It looks like this person is getting two discounts, which is making, hey, what I'm going to pay this year lower than my full risk premium. One of those, this is a pre-firm structure. So this was built before the flood insurance rate maps and those regulations. And then also it has an annual increase cap, and that's shown as $200 here. So what do you need to know? New policies, they're going to be rated at full risk rate. For renewals, they'll kind of be on a glide path up to their full risk rate. For real estate professionals, insurance agents, we want everybody to know if a structure has an existing policy, consider that transfer process. The buyer assuming the policy of the seller is something you should be talking about way before closing. It's something maybe you could even promote in the selling process for that structure. Hey, we have a flood insurance policy. We're willing to transfer that policy. It could be a big, pro or selling point for that structure. And in the past, we may have thought about this more in our zones A and V, but even in zone X, somebody has an existing policy, they're willing to transfer it to the owner who would assume it. That's awesome. So definitely have those conversations. A few things that are not changing. Again, there will be those limited caps on increases. The flood insurance rate maps are still going to be used for those floodplain management regulations, those local floodplain permits and development requirements. And letters of map change are still happening. Elevation certificates are still being used for compliance, although not required on the flood insurance side. And then a few things that we're keeping, premium discounts to policyholders. So newly mapped discount, this is something that you should know about if you have a map change in your area. if a person is newly mapped into the high risk flood area, they could actually get a discount on their policy if maybe they're going from a zone X to a zone A or B. So you want to be asking your insurance agent if you're eligible for that newly mapped discount. If it's an older structure, potentially the pre-firm discount. We talked about assuming or transferring policies. We definitely recommend that. The CRS discount is a great thing. We really recommend community participation in that. And then group flood insurance policies, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but that's not something you can buy. It's something that would be tied to FEMA disaster assistance. We have a little bit of a complex chart here, but this is kind of giving a few different scenarios. Let's say we have a class 4 CRS community. So that associated discount is 30%. But now let's think about some individual structures. Some of the baseline things that you would need to know is, hey, if somebody is buying a new policy, awesome. It's going to be subject to that full risk rate. They could potentially be able to get that CRS discount right away. However, if the structure is in the high risk flood area, those zones A or B, and it's not compliant, if it's built out of compliance with those floodplain management regulations, they will not be able to have access to that CRS discount. There are waiting periods, of course. We all know about these, but that typical 30-day waiting period before a policy goes into effect is really important. We're counting down to hurricane season right now, but we know an event can happen at any time. There are a few exceptions to that, so it's definitely good to know. If flood insurance is required due to its location in the special flood hazard area because you have that federally backed mortgage or loan, awesome. You could have a 0-day waiting period. We do have one that's special if there's a wildfire on federally owned federal property. If there's a wildfire, there's an increased risk of flooding. There could also be a 0-day waiting period for that. And then we had just talked about that newly mapped policy. If your structure is now determined to be in the high risk flood area, you may be able to access this newly mapped policy, and it would just be a 1-day waiting period. So let's talk about some averages in Louisiana. We have Hurricane Laura up here. Flood insurance average claim was about $57,000. FEMA disaster assistance was just about $2,800. So a huge gap there in how people are able to recover after an event. For those 2016 floodings, just an incredible Nfip average claim was over $91,000. FEMA disaster assistance was just over $9,000. You may be wondering about repetitive Nfip claims. So in Louisiana, we have about over 30,000 repetitive loss structures, so repeat Nfip claims, and they're not mitigated. Louisiana is one of the top in the country for having those repeat Nfip claims. And if a structure is mitigated, you can work with your floodplain administrator, and you can move forward the process so those prior claims can kind of be erased if you can show that the structure has been properly mitigated. So something to talk to your floodplain administrator about. And then some of you wonder, hey, how can I find out on this structure about past Nfip claims? So here's the process. What's important to know is you as the real estate professional, you can't just request this. You're going to have the structure owner request the Nfip flood loss history. They can call that FEMA mapping and insurance exchange number or email them. And that owner would kind of have to prove, yes, I'm the homeowner. And then their loss history will be mailed to them or emailed to them. And this is something they could provide to the seller. Unfortunately, it's not like an open source lookup type of system because this is people's private information. So what about some of the things that you should consider, especially in regards to disclosure? This is something that a lot of people don't know about. There's actually a federal flood insurance requirement when people get federal disaster assistance. So I'm going to specifically talk right now about the FEMA flood insurance requirement after FEMA disaster assistance. We sometimes call this the obtain and maintain requirement. So this would apply to, it could apply to homeowners or renters. If you're in a high risk flood area, so again, your zones A or your zones V, you get FEMA disaster assistance for a flood event. So maybe they give you repair dollars for your home, dollars to replace your belongings. If this was from a flood event and you're in the high risk flood area, on your FEMA award letter, it will actually say you have a requirement to get and keep flood insurance, or else you need to turn this, you can turn this award back to FEMA. And this is something that people need to disclose to new owners. So for the homeowner, this obtain and maintain requirement stays with the structure. And that structure owner would have to disclose to the next person, hey, you need to get and keep flood insurance as well. Or if there's a next federally declared flood event, you may not be able to access those federal assistance dollars unless you get and keep flood insurance. For renters, as long as I stay at that rental address, I would have to get flood insurance for my contents, but as long as I move, that requirement is lifted. And if you're thinking about, hey, well, what about the structure owner, a landlord, somebody that maybe has a rental home, they're renting it out to their tenants, that person's not going to be eligible for FEMA disaster assistance for their structure because it's not their primary home. But those applicants, those tenants inside would be able to request and may be eligible for FEMA disaster assistance. We do have publications on this, and Louisiana Realtors has also done some good work, blogging, posts on their website, and even a sample addendum on this. So we love how you guys are trying to educate your membership. So in Louisiana, we have about 150,000 structures that have this requirement. So that's big. This map here is showing to the right, the darker colored areas are showing you where you have a higher concentration of this obtain and maintain requirement. And again, if this were up to me, it'd be awesome if this was a public website you could go to and just see, hey, does this structure have this requirement? But FEMA is big on protecting people's private information. So only that structure owner can kind of call FEMA and ask, hey, do I have this requirement? What amount of coverage do I need to get and keep to be compliant with this requirement for flood insurance? The average FEMA disaster assistance is about $4,000 to $6,000. So FEMA only requires you to get that same amount of coverage. So maybe $4,000 to $6,000 of flood insurance to remain compliant with this requirement. However, we recommend people just get as much flood insurance coverage as you can because you'll be able to have a better recovery outcome for that. One more important thing to note is if a structure has this requirement, but if the maps change and now this structure is actually shown to be in zone X, that requirement lifts for that structure. And again, I'm only talking about FEMA's disaster assistance flood insurance requirement. Other federal agencies, other programs might have different requirements. I think about the obtain and maintain requirement as a big umbrella. Group flood insurance policies, it's just a small portion under this big umbrella. So after a FEMA, a federally declared flood event, we have some survivors, and usually these are our lowest income survivors. Maybe they don't meet the requirements for an SBA loan. They live in that high risk flood area, zones A or B, and they're getting some repair or replacement dollars. They may be eligible for a 3-year group flood insurance policy. It's really awesome. FEMA's providing this Nfip policyholder to these at-risk survivors. Right now, they have about $75,000 in coverage if an event would happen this year, for example. Now these GFIP certificate holders, they can make a claim at any time for 3 years for a flood event, even if it's not federally declared. So they have $7,500 in coverage. They only have a $200 deductible. That's awesome. And there's, for some of our recent disasters, you can see how many group flood insurance policies have been given for those different disasters and when those would expire. And one really hard thing about thinking about that 3 years coming to an end is those people are still under that big umbrella of, okay, they got flood insurance for a short time, but they're still under that big umbrella. I have to keep flood insurance, if I'm the homeowner for as long as that structure exists, even the next owner, if I'm a renter, as long as I stay there. And for our most vulnerable survivors, it can be even more hard for them to afford coverage, but reminding them that, you only need to get amount of coverage equal to the amount of your award is good, or as much as you can afford. Just a little bit of information on FEMA trying to work with communities. We are working really hard to get loss data to our communities. I can't give this to you as a real estate professional, like individual address level data. Here's some aggregate information. So these are those Nfip repeat losses in Louisiana, about 30,000 of them. Well, FEMA is also trying to get that other loss data to the communities as well. So if we look at the map to the right, this is actually that FEMA disaster assistance after a flood event, and where these people have the obtain and maintain requirement. You see this is actually much bigger than Nfip repeat claims. So when you look at these two data sets together, you get a much bigger picture of, hey, where is flooding happening in my community? How can we mitigate to make our communities really resilient? So we are working really hard to get this data to community leaders. Again, disclosure for any of these requirements really is key. Louisiana Realtors did a sample addendum, so you can check that out here. But we really love that they're trying to educate people on this requirement, because in Louisiana, it could be very common. The next flood event happens, and we don't want anyone to come to FEMA if there's another federally declared disaster, and an owner comes in or a renter comes in and they want to get assistance, and FEMA has to tell them, I'm so sorry, you had this requirement on the structure. And it would be even more painful to find out it wasn't even you that got the requirement, it was the previous owner. So some questions on the seller's disclosure that we'll cover here. Again, kind of just a general reminder, the disclosure should be taken with a grain of salt, because this is not something that you as the real estate professional are filling out. It's that seller, and it's really only what they're aware of. So what are they really aware of? So some things they may not be disclosing just because they don't have knowledge of it. So let's look at some specific questions. Section 1, this is a section on land, and the question 3 asks, are you aware of any servitudes or encroachments regarding the property? So this could be a one that could be tied to floodplain management somehow. Maybe there's an easement on the property, maybe there's a floodway on the property. This could be leading towards some of those floodplain management regulations. You can check with your local floodplain administrator if you're not sure, and those are things that should be disclosed. If there's a designated wetland on the property, this is an Army Corps of Engineers thing, not a FEMA thing, but also special regulations would apply. And then if we're looking at section 3, the structure. So question 8 says, what is the approximate age of the structure? This is, something to be thinking about, because remember we said a lot of times potentially those older structures, if it's an older structure in those zones A or B, it could be more likely that the structure may not meet current floodplain development requirements. So if it's damaged, if it's going to be improved, we're going to do a remodel, or it's damaged by a disaster. Okay, we may have to mitigate the structure. Again, that FRED acronym, flood proof for non-residential, relocate, elevate, demolish. So that could be a huge cost you're not necessarily thinking of when I just say, hey, this property's cute. If I think about what is the future of what owning the structure may mean, age could give you some of those things to be thinking about. Question 9, we really like this question. Have there been any additions or alterations to the structure during the time the seller owned the property? And were the necessary permits and inspections obtained? So again, this could relate to, is this structure substantially damaged or substantially improved? Some of our communities actually have online-based permitting systems where you can see some of the past permits for a property, talking to the local floodplain administrator, asking that seller hey, what's been done? Does this meet floodplain management regulations? All of that would have ramifications for what that next owner could do with the property or costs that they may have to expend in the future. Section 6 has all to do with flood. So of course, asking about anything that they're aware of. Has there been flooding on the land? That could be different than is there flooding on the structure? It's asking about the flood zone. It's also asking, if it has an elevation certificate and being able to provide that. So really good questions here. And we also talked a little bit about you could have multiple flood zones, the property itself or the structure itself, if it's hitting 2 zones, but if it's one of those hits a high risk flood area, that structure itself would be considered in the special flood hazard area. It also goes on to ask about flood insurance, and that's really good. And so it's also asking to provide a copy of the declarations page so you can get an idea, hey, what coverage does this person have? Can I assume this policy? You're getting some idea of their coverage limits and what coverage that they had on the structure. This is really good to know, and really thinking about assuming and transferring policies is a really good thing. And we really, really like that the disclosure asks more about past federal disaster assistance. So that's just what we talked about, that it really does depend on, hey, what federal agency did you get that assistance from, and what are their requirements? Because even within, let's say FEMA, we have the FEMA disaster assistance side. They may have one requirement, but on the FEMA mitigation grant side, there may be different flood insurance requirements for that property. This also asks about a lot of people were affected by the road home program. So as much information as you can find out from that previous owner, and trying to do your research to find out, does the structure have this requirement? And bottom line, if you don't know, get the insurance anyway. That way you'll be covered, you can recover, and you potentially would be eligible for that future disaster assistance. So some tips. Again, we definitely really recommend the transferring or assuming of the policies. Sellers could consider mitigation projects to make the structures or property more resilient. Providing that elevation certificate is always a good thing. And you guys as real estate professionals, always recommending flood insurance coverage and trying to educate about some of the flood risks. Here's a little real estate posting that Teresa pulled for me. Sometimes a listing can alert your buyers to, hey, has this home been either flood damaged? Is it recently improved? And the part that we have highlighted in yellow here says flood insurance is not required. And we really kind of want to make the point that, ethically, while this may be technically correct, this statement, we really would want this type of statement changed to, hey, maybe it's not required or mandatory, but it's really encouraged or it's available. So these are just some of the things you could think about even with listings, and how do we talk about flood risk and flood insurance. We have tons and tons of resources for you. Again, you should have access to this PDF in the chat. We just went over some of the main sites. These are most of the resources that we had already talked about during the training. And a really cool thing to know is on agents.floodsmart.gov, they have a resource library. Over in the top left, you'll see a publications order form, and to the right, you see a bunch of samples of our publications. You can actually order these for free, and they can be mailed to your home. They have a door hanger, you can put it on your properties, multiple languages as well. This is something you can access, or maybe you just want to link to it and post about it. A lot of you guys are active on social media. The Nfip is also on LinkedIn. If you want to connect with them on LinkedIn, you'll get some flood facts throughout the year. We have some Louisiana specific products as well you could share. And you guys as real estate professionals, maybe insurance agents, others attending, if you haven't been affected by a flood yourself, you probably have family and friends that have, and you guys know the devastation of this. And what it takes to recover from these type of events. So us all being able to try to help close that insurance gap, educate on flood risk is really important. And you guys are, you know, a really big stakeholder, a big partner in us communicating that. So we want to say thank you to you guys for what you do. You wear so many hats. You have to know so much for your clients. Thank you for being our partner in that. Our contact information is listed here as well. And I know we're right at 12. Angela, do we want to take about 10 minutes of questions, or?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so about 10 minutes for questions. Let me start with what I believe are the most imperative questions here. It is difficult for me to understand how I can be in a flood egg zone and my full risk rate will be $2,800 when I didn't flood or come close to flooding in 2016. Comparing this to a client who flooded and received over $200,000 in 2016 as a flood premium that went down to under $500 when it was almost $2,000. As professionals, how do we explain this? Okay, it's if you don't mind, Rebecca, let me touch on this one a little bit because of risk rating 2.0. It's imperative to remember that our preferred risk policies were based off of the location on a flood map. At no time was it ever based off of its true risk. And because of this, we have found that 33% of our claims have been in areas of minimal flooding, these zone X's. So we had to have a way that was be able to use nationwide to reflect the true risk for individual structures. So that is why we're doing away with PRPs. That's why we're not using flood zones. So simply because you did not experience water in your house, that's maybe a good indication that there wasn't a 1% annual event there. But moving forward, every structure will be rated off their true risk, no longer because of their location on a paper map. Okay, Rebecca, one question. I'd like to know why FEMA keeps giving people money when they flood, when they refuse to purchase flood insurance. I have talked to these people and that's why they don't buy flood insurance.
Great point there. And, you know, I actually like getting this question because I hear this and some people even use it as a, right, why should I get it? If these other people will just keep getting assistance and they don't have coverage. I showed the averages, guys, right? The average FEMA disaster assistance is about $4,000 to $6,000. So it's, in one way, it's probably, it's not the right thinking, hey, these people are going to get tons of money from FEMA. No, the average amount they're getting to fix their house, to make a full recovery on their house, to replace their belongings, $4,000 to $6,000. So the average that you can get by having flood insurance all time in Louisiana, $55,000. Let's go back to that 2016 flooding event, $91,000. So, you know, I understand the concerns there, but if someone is not insuring themselves, they absolutely will not be able to recover, repair their home, replace their belongings. So that's the counterpoint that I would give to that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. And I did type this answer in the chat, but let me go over it one more time. Rebecca mentioned something about 3 quotes from an insurance agent. You are not price shopping. The premium is going to be the same. What you are looking for is knowledge and experience in your agent, because the information they put into the quote is what is going to dictate the actual premium. So if they are not experienced and they make mistakes in the quoting process, then your premium will not be quoted correctly. So what we are doing is interviewing the agents to ensure they have a low level of experience and knowledge, because remember that these are the same people you're going to be submitting your claim with in a flooding event. So with that, let me move on to the next one, Rebecca. Are local and state levy systems considered when developing risk profiles?
And Gilbert, do you think they're talking about like the risk rating 2.0 premium or the maps and the map product? So it could be both. So kind of maybe depending on where you're going for that question.
I think they're referring to both. I think they're referring to just
Okay.
levy systems in large. And yes, levy systems are captured. They were captured under the legacy system, and they will be captured under risk rating 2.0. The caveat is that the levies have to be incorporated to the Army Corps of Engineers levy data set in order to receive credit. So that means the levies under constructions, levies that are being rebuilt, levies that show that they don't provide any protection are not going to be in that data set. But once it's in that data set, it was included in the legacy system and it will remain in the system for risk rating 2.0. Rebecca, does flood coverage cover tsunami? I'm sorry, here we go.
So yeah, well, will depend on the damage, right? So what type of damage do you have? So does that tsunami cause flood damage, as would be defined in the flood insurance manual? So how is that water damage coming into your home? If you're getting water damage because your roof is damaged, you're having rain coming in through your roof, if your windows are busted out and you're having wind-driven rain coming in through your windows, and you have water damage inside your house, Nfip flood insurance is not going to cover that type of damage. But if the tsunami is causing, rising water that is coming out, from outside your house, typically in and rising up, then it could be covered under Nfip flood insurance.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next question is, can you build a levee around a home in a V zone? It really depends. If you build a levee around a home, you won't receive any benefit on the insurance side, and you'll still have to be in full compliance of all regulations. Now, V zones are some of the most restrictive zones we have for development. You can't bring in structural fill into the V zones. I'm not quite sure how it would work, but I know the cost would be astronomical to try to do that. Rebecca, the next question is, how reliable is the flood zone on the MLS?
Ooh, I don't know what that is. I don't know what it looks like or where
exactly. So the MLS has probably taken some type of overview from the National Flood Hazard Layer or Map Service Center, but that's not something we created. So you would have to ask the developers, whoever created that, their level of accuracy. All right, let me move on over here. Here's a good one for you, Rebecca. How is it possible that Louisiana has more flood events than Florida, and why do they pay less than we do?
Ooh, I've heard from a few, and I've heard from many in Florida. I don't know if they're paying less than we are, but I actually hear a lot of the same concerns when I'm kind of listening on social media, or from some of the programming that I'm seeing. So from real estate professionals, insurance agents, and property owners, hearing a lot of the same concerns. One thing I will say about Florida, and this really is, there is a connection between really high building codes and building standards and floodplain management and people reducing their risk. And if you truly do have some risk reduction things, those can affect your premium. It's not how we thought about it before. Oh, if I just elevate 1 feet, I'll get this discount on my flood insurance. But all of those high building codes, maybe setback standards for how close I can build to the coast, or how close I can build to a flooding source or a floodway, for example. Really high building standards that incorporate a lot of things like open foundations, flood venting, how high structures must be elevated. When you add all that up, it really can reduce a structure's risk and reduce a premium. So I will say that for Florida, we really recommend states adopting really high building codes. I love this quote, the minimum floodplain management regulations, or the minimum adopted building codes. So for example, in Louisiana, that is the worst you can build a house. It's not the best you can build a house in that area. It's the worst you can build a house in that area. So building code should be getting us thinking about, what does industry-wide, professionally, when we put everybody's heads together from an international level, when we build a structure like this, it's going to be more resistant to all these types of hazards. And the more we can adopt the most recent building codes and keep our codes up to date, adopting the most recent and even going above that, it's going to reduce risk and reduce all types of insurance premiums.
Let me also add, this may sound like it's not true, but Louisiana has some of the lowest flood insurance premiums in the country. They have been, I think it's less than 7 states have lower flood insurance premiums than the state of Louisiana. And Louisiana, unfortunately, does lead the country in the amount of claims. So you're looking at multiple loss structures, repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, which add on to the insurance costs. Moving on, Rebecca, we got about 1 more minute. Why do elevation certificates expire? I'm sorry, no, the elevation certificate doesn't expire, the form expires, but that's just a federal tracking procedure. The question is, will an elevation certificate only be done once in a life of a home?
And we would suggest that, hey, information does change. If you do have something that's, looking like it's getting pretty old, it could be beneficial to have a survey done to get the most accurate, up-to-date information. So like Gilbert said, the form expires, but not the form. And what we mean by that is, so if you're having a new survey done, they can't use an old form. If I'm having a new survey done, I have to use right now the 2019 elevation certificate. Like we had mentioned, the draft is out right now for a 2022 certificate. So once that's kind of in place, if you're getting a new survey done, they'll have to use the 2022 form. But if you have something that's existing, it could still provide beneficial information, both on the floodplain management side, maybe on the flood insurance side. So definitely having it, passing it on to a new buyer is beneficial.
Let me add on a little bit. You treat an elevation certificate like the firms. Remember, the flood insurance rate maps are a snapshot of time, and over time, things change. It's the same with the elevation certificate. When the elevation certificate was created, it was created using the ground truth at that time. So if you're in an area with a lot of development, a lot of growth, that ground truth is no longer accurate. So you would want to update that EC to capture the new ground information. And that's it, Rebecca. We have hit our 10-minute mark. So thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Great questions came in there. Appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. Your certificates of completion for this course will be emailed to those who were in attendance full on camera for the 2 hours on April the 29th. Thank you so much.